presently lunch break on our last day of the MP, no? Okay. And it's session 16. My name is Sarah Imani, I'm the chair, but I'm a very, very quiet chair because most of the discussion might be in Spanish. I'm just facilitating and I will be handing over to Paulo, my colleague who's the discussant and who's very capable as a Colombian to speak Spanish. So, and I would hand it over to you and then the panel as such, so they can introduce themselves and their work and how they came to do the research to their topic. Yeah, and I think each presentation has like 15 minutes and then the discussant can respond. Voilà, c'est tout. Yeah.
Or maybe Sarah, you can follow the order of the program. I think it was Paola.
Oh, so the order of the panel on genocide and other serious violation is we start with Paola, and then then if you can project.
Yeah. Paola. Yeah. ¿Sí?
No.
No. Ah, perdón. ¿XC?
No.
No, es el otro. Perfecto. Yo, espera, me voy a compartir. Okay.
So I would like to say thank you for the organization for inviting me. And I would like also explain that the presentation is in English because the first time I thought to talk in English, but after there is a lot of colleagues here that prepared that to speak in Spanish. After 3 days talking in English in other language, maybe will be easier and relaxed. So I propose a kind of multicultural presentation between English and Spanish. So for me, any language is okay. So I'll back to Spanish, okay? Can you please? Bueno, pues me voy a empezar presentando, pero igual me poniendo como un estudio de caso antes de hablar de lo que es lo principal de esta presentación, que está muy destinada a comprender los desafíos de las poblaciones indígenas, en este caso, alrededor de Belo Monte. ¿Me puedo quedar allí? Porque me siento un poco rara de estar...
No te van a ver en la cámara, es por eso.
¿Me puedo solamente un poco acá?
Sí, pero ya.
¿Me ves, Pablo?
Ah, sí, ahí te va a ver.
Ahí
te va.
Ahí te estoy viendo, sí.
Vale, entonces me voy a presentar un poco a la parte como cientista, pero también como defensora de derechos humanos, porque soy profesora de la Universidad Federal de Pará, en la Amazonía, y al mismo tiempo soy defensora de derechos humanos ligada al Comité Brasileño de Defensores y Defensoras de Derechos Humanos, que es un gran colectivo de ONGs, movimientos sociales de Brasil, y estamos muy dedicados a pensar programas de protección e igual las estrategias de autoprotección y las causas estructurales de amenazas de muerte a defensores y defensoras de derechos humanos. Entonces, para esta presentación, yo elegí el caso de Belo Monte, porque es un caso icónico que se va a presentar también todas las dificultades legales en el sistema legal brasileño, pero aparte también en el sistema interamericano. Así que muchas veces pensamos que la solución es tener una ley de protección, pero aunque mismo la tengamos, esto se va a aportar otros tipos de dificultades. Una vez que vamos a identificar normalmente las causas de las amenazas, están muy relacionadas con los conflictos agroambientales, con conflictos políticos, económicos y con aspectos muy fuertes de corrupción. Entonces, por eso hago esta pequeña introducción, empezando a ponerme también como un estudio de caso, porque aparte que soy cientista, me vengo y los que trabajan en América Latina saben que hay una tradición muy fuerte de las universidades hacer también lo que llamamos de prácticas extensionistas, o sea, esta prestación de servicio a comunidades aparte de lo que es la educación formal. Entonces, desde allí estuvimos con un proyecto que ha sido financiado por el IDRC de Canadá y en conexión con varias ONGs, defensores y defensoras de derechos humanos, y aquí hacer un ojo, un paréntesis, que seguimos entonces esa definición que viene de la ONU, ¿no? Y que después se apropia del sistema interamericano, igual el Programa Nacional Estatal de Brasil, que va a comprender individuos o grupos que están en la lucha continua por derechos humanos y que vienen amenazados de muerte en relación a su trabajo. Entonces, esta es la conexión y también que esto se venga de una forma continua y efectiva. Así que en este trabajo que estaba haciendo, venía algunas veces amenazado de muerte hasta que han atirado en nuestra casa. Y con esto me venía a Francia por Le Programme POS, que es un programa de acogida de cientistas en peligro, en situación de amenaza o mismo de guerras, de una tradición en sí. Y por eso estoy hoy como profesora asociada al EIHL, al Instituto de Altos Estudios de la América Latina, en la Sorbonne Nouvelle, que es la Paris. Entonces, de ahí, ¿por qué elegí que habláramos un poco a empezar pensando qué son ciudadanos, qué conceptos de ciudadanía podemos cortar? Y cuando hablamos de eso en materia de pueblos indígenas, antes de entrar en los temas de amenaza de muerte, igual comprender un poco este aspecto más singular de Belo Monte. Porque estamos aquí todo el tiempo hablando de decolonización, ¿no? O de anticolonización, para los que quieran una otra referencia teórica, que se va un poco más aparte de la decolonización. Y la idea misma de ciudadanía, cuando hablamos de pueblos indígenas, es que estamos pensando, por ejemplo, para tener algún parámetro de discusión, en esta idea de ciudadanía constelación, donde hay varios órdenes, algunas veces incompatibilidades, y que muchas veces en los sistemas coloniales se ven exactamente como en Brasil, aunque podemos decir, bueno, los pueblos indígenas en Brasil sí que hay una ley constitucional de su protección, pero yo cuestiono, ¿es una ley constitucional de protección o de control? Les dejo primeramente esta pregunta, porque en esta idea de racionalidad, de que no hay una pluralidad de órdenes constitucionales, que se niega el derecho de los pueblos indígenas originarios, es un poco como pensar también este movimiento que ellos han hecho durante mucho tiempo y que hoy, por ejemplo, se nota con el Ministerio de Derechos Humanos y el Ministerio de Pueblos Indígenas en Brasil, que está a cargo de una representación directa. Y también cabe preguntar, pues, ¿cuánto los pueblos han hecho para adecuarse una vez más a una forma de Estado que es una construcción política ficticia y que ellos tienen que aprender una otra lengua que no es la suya y adecuarse a este modelo? Entonces, a pensar un poco cómo se viene esta idea, entonces, que también podemos presentar de ciudadanía multicultural, ¿no? Y que países, por ejemplo, como Bolivia, lo comprende, Ecuador también, incluso sistemas constitucionales paralelos, otras formas de comprender que hay varias naciones, no necesariamente necesitamos pasar a comprender toda esta lucha de los pueblos indígenas hacia una dirección de se conformar con el modelo colonial. Esto me preocupa mucho. Yo estuve leyendo, por ejemplo, estudios antropológicos que sugerían como estrategia la necesidad de apropiación de la lengua, de ocupación en los espacios públicos, políticos. Y yo también pregunto, ¿esto no es una vez más la colonización? Porque al final es siempre a los pueblos indígenas, que no son un bloque, son muchos pueblos con distintas constituciones políticas, económicas, sociales, adecuarse a un modelo para que puedan, de hecho, entrar en sus derechos. Y bueno, entonces acá es un poco más para pensarnos en nivel de reflexión y también para pensarmos en este nivel de ciudadanía multicultural, porque muchas veces terminamos, cuando trabajamos con temas de pueblos indígenas, pensando cómo podemos ayudar, cómo podemos actuar para su protección. Pero ¿es que son objeto de nuestro estudio de ayuda o son protagonistas de su vida y al final son los que nos ayudan incluso a un otro modelo de tecnología que para mí es mucho más avanzada, de preservación del medio ambiente y que nos hace al final estar vivos, respirar, ¿no? Porque para nosotros las migraciones al final se va por un capitalismo verde. Y más una cosa para pensar. Por favor. Entonces, para que podamos compreender un poco lo que pasa en la situación de Belo Monte, a volta do Rio Xingu, a volta grande do Xingu, esto está en la floresta amazónica, ¿no? En mi población, que Pará, la ciudad más grande allá es Altamira. Este es un proyecto económico de hidroeléctrica que ya viene de décadas. Se comienza con el periodo de dictadura militar y la abertura de este grande proyecto económico para la Amazonía, que es marcado por algunas cuestiones. La primera, la verticalización, es decir, decisiones políticas y económicas de arriba para abajo. La otra, la estratificación. No hubo ningún diálogo con las poblaciones locales. Esto ha sido también un tercero concepto de consecuencia, la fragmentación, que ha hecho con que muchas veces las comunidades y pueblos no hayan tenido la oportunidad misma de tener un enforce de su lucha conjunta. Entonces, en este caso, después, aunque haya pasado el periodo de dictadura militar, es desafortunadamente un elemento a decir que el PACE, que ha sido el Programa de Aceleración del Crecimiento, y el momento en que Belo Monte de hecho empieza a ser implementada, es el periodo del gobierno Dilma. Entonces estamos hablando de un periodo supuestamente de democracia, que está involucrado con el Partido de los Trabajadores, como ahora se empieza a retomar, pero también marcado por esta historia de la Amazonía, que es completamente afectada por los grandes proyectos políticos y económicos. Es interesante comprender que la población de Pará, y acá casos muy emblemáticos como de la Irmã Dorothy, así también como Ademir Federetti, que es el DEMA para nosotros, pero igual muchísimos defensores y defensoras de derechos humanos son asesinados en Pará. Si buscamos la relatoría de la CPT, que es la Comisión Pastoral de la Tierra, allá se va a notar que después de décadas el estado del Pará es el que presenta el mayor índice de asesinatos en el campo, porque por una parte somos afortunados por recursos hídricos, por una potencialidad para el desarrollo del agronegocio, de minería, de construcción de hidroeléctricas y todo eso, pero que también es nuestro desastre, es nuestro fracaso, porque se hace con eso una gran migración de personas incluso que después van a estar alrededor de estos proyectos en situación de trabajo análoga de la esclavitud. Entonces, por ejemplo, Altamira en este periodo ha sido la ciudad más violenta de Brasil por todo el flujo migratorio, que también después ha hecho que esas personas no pudieran volver. Pero aparte de eso, no ha sido una decisión política pacífica, y es donde vamos a llegar que este caso nos trae a pensar el tema de cómo los proyectos político-económicos generan estos impactos, afectan a los pueblos indígenas, también en las comunidades tradicionales, y aunque hayamos todo un sistema legal, esto se pasa a un lado alrededor de estas relaciones. Hubo muchas denuncias, pero igual muchas acciones judiciales del Ministerio de la Fiscalía Pública Federal, que es el encargado por competencia para controlar estas leyes. Y todas las situaciones de irregularidad en Brasil han sido objeto de más de 10 acciones civiles públicas, que es este instrumento jurídico en Brasil utilizado para denunciar que la ley no está siendo respetada. Pero aún así, el gobierno Dilma ha decidido implementar Al final, Brasil ha sido condenado por el Sistema Interamericano de Derechos Humanos y puso a perder la estabilidad de las relaciones internacionales porque la contestación ha sido, pues bien, lo vamos a hacer, y si seguimos presionados, amenazamos salir del Sistema Interamericano, pues este es un proyecto. El tema es que eso no para por ahí, porque hay dentro de esta idea de aceleración del crecimiento en la Amazonía más 33 hidroeléctricas que están pensadas para continuar construidas. Incluso si ustedes acompañan, por ejemplo, la lucha del pueblo Munduruku, está como San Luis de Tapajós, que es una región muy importante, casi que para desaparecerse. De hecho, se construye la hidroeléctrica allá. Entonces, si podemos pasar acá viendo un poco más de esta información que ya se los anticipé, diciendo que exactamente la gente que se va a denunciar, todo eso se viene amenazada de muerte. Entonces creo que podemos pasar porque el tiempo nos va. Y acá para que tengamos un poco más claro los confrontos legales. Entonces, por ejemplo, la primera acción civil pública que ha sido en 2001, la irregularidad ha sido inconstitucional incluso, porque el artículo 231 de la Constitución brasileña demanda que haya una autorización del Congreso brasileño para el proyecto y que es absolutamente necesario la escucha cualificada de las audiencias públicas en conformidad también con la Convención 169 de la OIT, lo que no ha sido hecho. Pero aún así siguen con los estudios y con los pedidos de implementación del proyecto. Esta es la foto que a mí me gustaría muchísimo que ustedes me dijeran qué les sale a los ojos a la primera vez. Esto ha sido la audiencia pública para escuchar las poblaciones afectadas. Pues miren que acá está como una grande pared de la Fuerza Nacional, que está como por arriba incluso de la Policía Federal. Y si pasamos a la siguiente, es todavía más emblemática. Pues miren hacia quién la policía está virada. Entonces, acá en la mesa están representantes del gobierno y sobre todo del Consorcio Belo Monte, que ha sido una otra construcción jurídica ficticia del gobierno de Brasil, después de la mal propaganda que ha pasado con los bancos internacionales que iban a financiar la hidroeléctrica. Entonces, al final, el financiamiento ha sido por el Banco Nacional de Desarrollo de Brasil. Y entonces, acá está toda la población, los movimientos sociales y una gran pared de la Fuerza Nacional a proteger la gente que está para hacer el emprendimiento. Y me parece que eso es muchísimo icónico para que nosotros podamos pensar lo que significa al final la ley, que incluso después muy se ha observado debatir en Brasil sobre el terrorismo y que al final está muy dedicada también a la criminalización de los movimientos sociales. Por favor. Esta es una otra acción civil pública que también ha sido negada. Mira, acá yo las elegí estratégicamente porque tenemos poco tiempo, pero todas las acciones civiles públicas están mencionadas en el PP. Pero 10 años después, todavía el Ministerio Público, la Fiscalía Federal, estaba entrando con denuncias. Y acá, por ejemplo, también una otra inconstitucionalidad de la Constitución Federal Brasileña, en que se observaba que no había sido hecho el estudio adecuado de prospección, minerario y de impacto ambiental. Y al final Belo Monte fue autorizado sin que hubiera de hecho un estudio propuesto de forma adecuada y que los estudios de impacto ambientales hubieran sido de hecho respetados con todos sus ritos. Entonces, para que comprendan que aunque haya todo un sistema legal de protección nacional e internacional, y aunque todos los impactos estaban informados, todo eso se ha pasado. Y acá, ya nos destinando al final, es muy interesante que con toda la conmoción pública que ha pasado, el ISA, por ejemplo, que es un Instituto Social Ambiental, ha hecho después una relatoría, un rapport, por decir algunas de las medidas que minimizarían los impactos y que jamás han sido cumplidas. Entonces, podemos observar acá que habían dicho, pues, este proyecto, aparte de instalar la hidroeléctrica, va a tener una gran estructura social, de salud y de infraestructura. Por ejemplo, jamás han sido avanzados los puestos de salud en los hospitales, los servicios de salud que habían sido propuestos. Igual, lo que hubo fue un grande fracaso del sistema de educación, porque mira que la ciudad se ha insuflado de gente y no había estructura para eso. También hubo muchas violaciones de derechos fundamentales de compulsión, de remoción compulsoria. Muchos pueblos indígenas fueron completamente obligados a salir de sus áreas. Esto ha afectado su modo de vida, muchos otros derechos que relatamos ahí en el paper y que después creo que ya podremos llevar un poco más al debate si quieren. Entonces, para respetar, no cansarles mucho y podemos escuchar a los amigos, me agradezco y paro aquí.
Much. I was named to your commitment, as far as I understood. It reminded me of the right to a healthy and sustainable development discussion going on in the United Nations. Discuss that. Now we are looking, I think, at the paper by Lise and this court, and I think it's about how we can use the Genocide Convention actually to protect human rights and how that needs to interrelate. So please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. So I will be speaking in English. I'm sorry about that. We thought this morning that it should be better to speak in Spanish, but we had no time to translate it back. So I'll do it in English now, and then at the end we can discuss in Spanish if you prefer. So we decided to present together first because we met in the field, and we're working with the same people. We work with the Yanomami, but also because we have very similar research questions. So I will very briefly outline what we plan to do, and then I will hand over to Luis. So in this presentation, we will discuss some practical and conceptual challenges of mainstream institutions with regards to indigenous lands, to environment and mining. Go to the next slide, please. So he will first explore the legal alternatives pursued by the Yanomami for the protection of their lands and, of course, their lives together, both within domestic judicial assistance and international human rights mechanisms. And he will also talk about the effectiveness of the efforts to prevent the materialization of genocide. And next, I will discuss two institutions governing land relations, environmental and mining law. And I will try to develop on why they might be inconsistent with indigenous and human rights, but more than that, they are inconsistent with indigenous knowledge. So what is the focus of the presentation? All these legal instruments are based on the categorical separation between humans and nature, with nature supposedly being object to domination, use, control, viewed as property, or even protected by humans. And we'll see the issues that it brings up. So our goal is to explore how Yanomami and other indigenous peoples' ethics towards more than human, or what we're calling nature, can offer us a way of rethinking institutions governing land relations. And we think it's important for two reasons. First, because we think that it's important to reconcile legal instruments that enable indigenous communities to live in their own lands according to their own terms, because this means really respecting autonomy and self-determination, but also because of a larger question of, well, we all know that we are already living in an ecological crisis. So rethinking those laws governing the earth is not a theoretical exercise, but it's also a need. So you can go to the next slide, please. This is just to show you where we are talking from. So the Yanomami are in this area between Brazil and Venezuela. Next, please. And we are concentrating on the red area, which corresponds to the Brazilian demarcated territory. And well, on my right side, you can see a map with some yellow spots. those yellow spots are requests for mining prospection authorization. They are not there anymore since very recently, I think last year, but they've been there since the 70s, so we know it's an ancient problem. I will hand over to Luis.
Much of my presentation is based on my research conducted as I worked as a lawyer with Instituto Socioambiental in partnership with Yanomami associations. I think it's important to clarify that as for sake of transparency. It's also important to state that a lot of the work I'm presenting also counted with inputs throughout this work from many colleagues that worked with me. So it has a much interdisciplinary approach. First, we should spend a few words contextualizing the Yanomami people and their struggle. We can move to the next slide. The Yanomami are traditionally inhabitants of the mountainous area of the Venezuelan-Brazilian border. It was only in the mid-20th century that the Yanomami people were systematically contacted by external society with the establishment of governmental posts and missionary settlements. From the 80s on, in the context of government development projects in the Amazon, a more aggressive invasion of the Yanomami territory by informal wildcat mining extraction, called garimpo in Portuguese, would follow the opening of a highway, the Perimetral Norte Highway. The tragic humanitarian consequences for most Yanomami villages that were affected would lead to the official demarcation of the Yanomami indigenous land only in 1992, not without a 2-decade-long worldwide campaign for its protection. In 1993, the Hashimu massacre took place with the escalation of a conflict between garimpeiros and the Yanomami village, an episode that became the first trial for genocide within the Brazilian domestic legal system. It was most probably not the only case, but it was the first to gather sufficient evidence to ensure legal condemnation of perpetrators. Since then, with the implementation of relatively effective policies for territorial protection and basic healthcare, which were later deranged, the population of the Yanomami grew again to reach for now around 27,000 individuals of the Yanomami and Yacuana peoples who share the same land, according to the last census in Brazil. This situation has changed dramatically since the 2010s, with a progressive retrocession of policies directed to the protection of indigenous people's rights and the environment alike in the Brazilian context. The Yanomami indigenous land witnessed a steep increase in illegal mining activity, bringing about severe human rights violations as a result of armed conflicts, sexual violence, forest degradation, mercury contamination, loss of hunting and fishing areas, and quick spread of contagious diseases. These are all accounted in reports that were developed by the Yanomami and Yacuana representative organizations. And while a radical change of directions in federal police policies since January 2023 were able to reduce the pace of deforestation by illegal mining by 90%, most of the affected villages still suffer the consequences, for instance, dealing with widespread malaria and malnutrition, along with other grave health conditions. Well, illegal wildcat mining has a daunting effect over the Yanomami lands ever since the opening of the Perimetral Norte Highway, which I referred to. And it has explicitly counted with the support of regional authorities that were at the time of the dictatorship appointed by the federal government. In those days, Brazil was ruled by a military regime. I think many people know that, and by sectors of the business class alike, and had little to no adherence to the standards set by international human rights system and the representative protective mechanism. When it comes to the Amazon forest, the region was a target of large-scale infrastructure projects that aim to develop the Amazon region. The prevailing notion of development of the regime is itself a matter of that inspires many reflections of the meaning attributed to the forest ecosystem, local peoples, and the respective relationships between humans and modern humans elements. The underlying rationale at the time, put simply, was to violate the virgin forest. And I borrow here the lyricism for Eliane Brum. that explains the gender layers of this chapter of Brazilian history. And the forest was projected as a symbol of savagery and underdevelopment in favor of an internal colonization process from southern states to the north, to the northern region, exploiting the labor force from the poorest section of society from the northeast. The plan was to occupy the ecosystem with exploitative economic activities following models foreign to it. Indigenous peoples and other traditional communities were not part of this equation, and human rights abuses were generalized and largely unaccounted for. There is several literature on this process from the field of geography, of which I would highlight Bertolt Beckers as well as Joana Bezerra. Well, as a military regime weakened and Brazil went redemocratization process in the late 80s and early 90s, the country's policy correspondingly shifted towards a more recognition and observance of international human rights mechanisms as a legitimizing strategy for the transition to civilian rule. While since the 80s, complaints in the case of the Yanomami were brought before the Inter-American human rights bodies, including the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, it was only in 1985, with the downfall of the dictatorship, that the organism set out a recommendation for the demarcation of the lands of the Yanomami in full, in opposition to the demarcation in islands proposed by the military in benefit of the colonization project and resource extraction in the area. The Yanomami indigenous lands were demarcated in 1992, the same year Brazil internalized the American Convention on Human Rights. As we have noted, the policies implemented following a demarcation were able to significantly diminish the continuing invasion of the Yanomami land forest, Urihi, and provide basic healthcare assistance, maintaining more or less stable condition until the renovated wave of invasions that was observed since the 2010s and more intensely since 2018. During the ex-President Bolsonaro's administration, which outspokenly and insistently worked in favor of cutting productivity in indigenous lands. Despite Bolsonaro's nostalgic reverence to the practices of the military regime, Brazil's legal framework under the 1988 Constitution was not quite the same, and indigenous representative organizations had access now to stronger legal mechanisms designed to safeguard their lands and peoples from gross human rights violations. With regard to the Yanomami, specifically, 3 main cases addressed the lack of control over illegal mining activity within the Yanomami land, all 3 already in the context of the COVID-19 pandemics. 2 at the domestic level and 1 at the international. You can pass to the next slide. At the regional level, the Federal Prosecutor Office filed a case at the Federal Justice in Roraima in 2020, demanding a plan to protect the Yanomami indigenous lands against invasions, to which Futucara Associação Yanomami joined as co-plaintiff. At the national level, the Articulation of Indigenous Peoples of Brazil, along with several allied organizations, filed a case before the Supreme Court, arguing for the lack of observance of constitutional principles found in the governmental policies directed to indigenous peoples at the time of the pandemic, requiring the intrusions of the Yanomami land among several other Yanomami on other indigenous lands that have people in voluntary isolation, along with other measures to diminish the impact of the pandemic. It is interesting to note that neither of these cases had been possible before the Constitution of 1998, because there was no legal provision for the procedural remedies for violations of human rights that these cases represent. Indigenous peoples were now able also to access indigenous international human rights mechanisms to enforce state obligations that they were documenting. The situation of imminent risk of grave breaches to human rights enabled the Yanomami Association Futucara to seek for the concession of precautionary measures within the Inter-American Commission, which were granted in 2020 and later converted to provisional measures before the Inter-American Court. Together with those 2 other cases that I referred to, They will reaffirm the obligation of the Brazilian government to design and implement a plan for impeding invasions and provide emergency health care in favor of the right to life, to health, and personal integrity of the Yanomami. This combines the 3 cases that I referred to, but in addition to those, APIB would also file a case before the International Criminal Court accusing Bolsonaro of genocide in face of his destructive policies against indigenous peoples of Brazil during that time. The justification for this case is grounded on several legal and administrative actions that impacted a wide range of peoples, if not all, and included those regarding the Yanomami indigenous land in specific. The ICC has not issued a decision on this case, but its proposition inspires conversations on the true potential of the Rome Statute to assess the practice of genocide and other crimes against humanity whenever indigenous peoples and their particular ways of being are involved. We will come back to this point later. For now, it suffices to indicate that the effectiveness of this series of juridical recognition from the referred domestic and international bodies, taken individually or combined together, is a matter of reflection, given the timid responses from the government until a change of administration occurred. Bolsonaro actively and continuously supported mining projects in the Amazon, including on indigenous lands and other protected areas. A sense of frustration followed as illegal mining activities continued to accelerate and conflicts escalated, which led to considerations of the capacity of international and domestic human rights norms and institutions to actually prevent and remedy genocidal practices. Such reasoning is not new and has been thoroughly discussed by human rights specialists in academia and beyond, particularly in the context of gross and generalized human rights violations. This has been assessed, for instance, when civil wars and state repression in Sierra Leone, but also during South Africa, in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that tried to explain how these gross human rights violations. Sorry, I lost myself a little bit here in the text. But anyway, how these reparations did not take into account the people's own demands. Chief Prosecutor of the International Human Rights Court, Luis Moreno Campos, in his opening statement, said that the effectiveness of the ICC should not be measured by the number of cases that reach it. On the contrary, complementarity implies that the absence of trials before this court as the consequences of regular functioning of national institutions would be a major success. This is a fair prospect if we assume national institutions are indeed functioning to that end. But with regards to investigations for genocide and crimes against humanity before the ICC, an apparent excess of selectivity to cases from ex-colonies from the African continent has raised question over the court's legitimacy to global South countries, pointing out to the need to rethink its functioning practice to counter accusations against it as an imperialistic tool from developed countries. We are following how this matter deals, the ICC is dealing now with the Israel-Palestine conflict in Gaza. Our aim here is not to question the historical importance of the ICC as an international human rights institution, nor its institutional role to hold perpetrators of genocide and crimes against humanity accountable. Rather, the intent is merely to ponder on the practical challenges to reach that objective in the prevailing landscape of international diplomacy. It should be equally noted the lack of decision recognizing genocide from the ICC or any other given institution for the matter does not in any case imply it has not occurred or is underway in practice. Our reflection lies on the capability of the institution to investigate, judge, and hold perpetrators accountable under the dominant interpretation to its current juridical institutes, especially when indigenous peoples are involved. In any case, a distinct point of view would ponder that how worse the impact of a particular conflict could have become had the respective human rights institutions not been accessible, providing some level of legitimization to the claims of ongoing human rights violations and recognition of the state obligations in their regard. This reflection may be rather speculative, but at least in the context of the Inter-American system, it is arguable that the existence of such institutions has had an important element for articulating policy change, along with civil society, despite party states' apparent failure to immediate accountability to its decisions. On another letter, it is debatable how much of existing human rights institutions are permeable to distinct ontologies and epistemologies that are represented in various indigenous peoples whenever they are implicated. Moreover, when those affected are beyond the human individual and their collectivity. Against the Inter-American system has gained authority in providing some level of culturally sensitive interpretation to human rights norms, for example, on the right to property, and contextualizing its exercise, customs, and ways of living of the people in the relevant cases it has assessed. Still, the prevailing rationale is fundamentally grounded on a human-centered perspective that may not fully comprehend indigenous notions around the agency of more than human existence, for instance. Latour, along with many other authors, have recalled how Judeo-Christian theological stances from the times of the Enlightenment have informed a strict separation between social sciences and natural sciences, in which the attribute of agency is exclusive to human rights species, whereas all that falls within the definition of nature functions as inert objects with predictable mathematical behavior, like the Newtonian laws of nature. We know as well that a lot of indigenous scholars question the definition of human as represented by Western science. Ailton Krenak speaks of a pluriversality in contrast to humanity as a single homogeneous category in opposition to the environment. Canadian indigenous scholar John Burroughs has likewise referred to the Anishinaabe distinct cosmologies in understanding agency within non-human existence. Many other could be cited here. While it is critical to avoid fitting indigenous peoples and their representative cosmologies into a simplistic, uniform, essentializing category, it can be imagined many ways in how taking this philosophical provocation seriously may challenge classic legal institutes that seem somewhat fixed and immutable. In defining legal personhood, in conceptualizing and implementing environmental rights as human rights, in characterizing genocide and ecocide. We will now explore some concrete examples. Luciana will cover them following.
Thank you. So I'll be seeking to further develop the subject of the non-integration of non-human or more than human agency in law by discussing an example that we find in the Yanomami indigenous land during the demarcation process. Can we go to the next slide, please? It's still yeah, thank you. So I'll go right to the spot, so I don't take so long. During the demarcation process,
that maybe we can stick to 10 minutes tops, like 5 to 10 minutes. Sorry, because we have like in total now 5 presentations. So
yeah, we prepare for 15 minutes.
yeah, we all
do.
Oh yeah,
Yeah, because we are two.
I know
we had
that's
to
what that's the problem now. So try 10 to 10 minutes, please.
Okay. So during the demarcation process in the 80s, let's remember it was during the military dictatorship. The government proposed to fragment the Yanomami indigenous land into sections with national forests and national parks. And the environmental protection areas would totalize 70% of the total territory. So national forests would allow for sustainable use. It comes from the conservationist idea that we can combine human presence and nature. And the environmental agency later tried to authorize wildcat mining within them. And on the other hand, national parks prohibit any kind of use of fauna and flora, which comes from the idea, the preservationist idea that the nature is untouchable and so human presence would harm it. Well, at the end, national wildcat mining use and no use at all. The Yanomami were between these two environmental categories that would not allow them to use the forest, 70% of their territory. Well, thanks to activism and the process that Luis already explained, the land was demarcated as we know it today, but conservation units were a threat for the land at this time. So two critics that we would like to address to environmental rights. So first, the category nature is easily absorbed by hegemonic interests of states and sometimes very often actually in partnership with corporations, and it's placed in competition with communities, usually reducing their rights, even when they already know that they are the ones caring the most for the environment. And second critique would be about treating nature as a resource and not as a living entity with its own agency. So in this view, humans are supposed to control nature or protect it, which at the end comes from the same idea. And this is what gives rise to all these management ideas about the environmental damage being compensated or paid for. For the Yanomami, this is completely different. It's hard to explain it in a few words, but their concept closest to the idea of land is that of Urihia, which can be translated as land forest. And the shamans negotiate all sort of phenomena with the other than humans living in the forest. Most of them are called Shapiri by them, which sometimes translated as spirit, but this is not the best translation. Well, anyway, the point is that the forest is alive, and for them it's necessary to develop an ethical relationship with it. And this is not only because it's from the Urihia that they receive the possibility of materially living. I don't want to romanticize it, but it's also because it's a social being. So as a social being, it's capable of giving, but it's also capable of harming. So it's a double sense care. Well, let's move to the next. I'll try to say a few words about mining. So very briefly, the problems about mining regulations. So first problem is that mining regulations haven't evolved with indigenous rights. Indigenous rights change, mining codes keep the same. So the protections in indigenous rights become very ineffective in context of indigenous lands overlapping mineral resources. Second thing, mining codes are for prioritizing public interest over private interest. But the problem is that public interest is understood as national interest. This is the main argument for mining on indigenous land, and this is the argument that wildcat miners movement and politicians such as Bolsonaro use against indigenous peoples. They're placed again as being against national interest. That's very serious. And third point is that subsoil mineral deposits are defined by a science. The science is geology, and geology is developed already on this narrative about national sovereignty and economic development, but also it continues to fuel it. So it's a kind of a self-reinforcing system. By indigenous laws, industrial mining and wildcat mining are now forbidden, but it happens anyway. So this narrative still has an effect, even if it's illegal. Well, a few points about mining we would like to criticize. First is that national interest or national development is defined in a very vertical manner, regardless of local interest, and usually conflicting with human rights. And second point is that it also conflicts with environmental rights because we don't know yet a method for mining that doesn't cause a huge damage. So a constitution or any kind of legal instrument that does not address the interaction between indigenous, environmental, and mining regulations will always be conflictive, and this conflict will be solved according to the political tendencies of each period. This is dangerous. Well, but what I would like to stress as the most important point is that indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. The Brazilian constitution recognized that indigenous relationship to the land precedes that of the colonizing state because they were there before the institution of the states. Then the right to inhabit their land must be interpreted according to their ways of life. But this has never happened. This has never been developed in conversation with them. So for the Yanomami, to say it in just one sentence, the subsoil must remain intact because there are beings in there that are dangerous. And it doesn't matter if we believe it or not. They say it based in experience because during the first gold rush, when people started digging the earth, they started dying because of contracting diseases in exchanging metal tools like machetes and axes. but what they say is based on knowledge and on experience. So the question we would like to leave you with, I don't know if we're gonna have time to conclusion, but is that one. If indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination and if their land should be understood through their ways of life, why do we not prioritize their cosmology in their own land governance? That is, if subsoil is untouchable for them, why are we still considering the implications of mining coal or geology in their lands? Well,
Yeah, I think that's a perfect wrap up and really leave us with a great discussion, question for discussion, and thank you for So the interesting, I think then you go I'm handing over to Katarzyna. It's really that when I read, especially when I read the spirits of the law, they are not talking to each other, like environmental law, genocide law, the mining laws. It's really interesting, and so it's really interesting to focus on indigenous and to, I don't know, unravel get them out those cosmologies in a very forensic way. And I know that the forensic architecture, you work with forensic architect on some the case. So with its forensic science, switch over to you because you will also be looking at very, very interesting case and methodology and methodology of the semantic case.
Okay. So, thank you very much. I will briefly introduce myself. So I will start by saying that I'm a biological anthropologist, and I think I am in minority here. I'm a researcher at the Department of Anthropology, Polish Academy of Sciences, and I'm also currently a visiting scholar at the School of Anthropology and Ethnography at the University of Oxford. And I'm very honored to be able to present to you today on behalf of the whole research team, because it's like very interdisciplinary project. So I'm just like a relator here. A brief account of our research regarding human rights violation case involving the Xavante community in Brazil. As many of the topics that I'm going to talk about are not of my specialty, I will need to support myself a bit with the papers. The archaeology of colonialism focuses on the intercultural relations of domination, in which the colonizer constantly uses violence to incorporate the land and subjugate the population, aiming to exploit the resources of the colonized territory. The consequences of the encounter between these two worlds have been a frequent question in archaeological research. And the materiality of violence is therefore a unique insight into the process of colonization or loss of land or other related crimes. The factors that act in the development and maintenance of historical narratives associated with processes of human rights violations are very complex. And the single discipline alone, in this case would be archaeology, is not capable of resulting sufficient and complete data on such a multidimensional process. For this reason, we opted to employ a highly interdisciplinary approach that combines theories and methodologies of archaeology, biological anthropology, linguistic, documentary research, among others, to investigate the stories of the present and the past. And in case where all human rights have been denied, we also add forensic sciences. One of the responsibilities of historical archaeology in Brazil is to discuss and bring to light cases involving issues of conflicts and violation of human rights caused by both colonialism and neo-colonial approaches. In Brazil, forensic investigations are the sole responsibility of the police. However, given the extremely high criminal rate in this country, police investigations rarely focus on crimes committed by the state in the past. Consequently, it is often up to academic projects to incorporate this type of research, which otherwise would probably not be carried out at all. Crimes committed by the Brazilian state on indigenous populations, especially during the military dictatorships, are not really being investigated due to the lack of systematic and scientific evidence, despite a pervasive common knowledge about such facts. The striking lack of investigation into abuses committed against indigenous populations permeates the entire history of Brazil. Despite multiple evidence of crimes against their heritage, freedom, life, also against crimes against different forms of social and cultural organization that are in contrast with certain notion of civilization project or ethnocentric assumption of progress. Human rights abuses and crimes against humanity are among several exceptions of crimes without a statute of limitations in Brazil, and as it is in many other countries as well. And for this reason, research, even academic, involving investigation of criminal activities of the state in cases of possible human rights violations, has to be conducted in a thorough and meticulous way, given the possibility of a further judicial case. In this sense, the theoretical framework of academic archaeological studies, as well as their methodology, should take on an interdisciplinary character, incorporating theories and methodologies from, for example, forensic scientists. Only in this way can the results delivered by scientists constitute legal evidence that could possibly be used in court. After this brief introduction, and in this context, I would like to present to you the assumptions and the initial results of our interdisciplinary project that is called Colonization of the Sacred Places of the Xavante territory of Maravaatseji and São Marcos. The project is led by Professor Claudia Plans from the Federal University of São Paulo, and it involves an international research team from Brazil, Poland, and Canada, and as well as participation of the representatives of the Xavante community. And the project is funded under the Transatlantic Platform for Social Innovation by 3 national agencies, the Polish, Brazilian, and Canadian. The main aim of our project is to contribute to the investigation and documentation of human rights violation against highly marginalized people, indigenous groups in Brazil. In collaboration with the indigenous community, we are working on documenting human rights violations using 2 geographically separated focal examples: the Xavante population from Maravaatseji, that's one, and the Xavante population from São Marcos. They are both located in the state of Mato Grosso in Brazil. Both communities belong to the same ethnic group, but they are separated geographically from each other about 500 kilometers. And currently, both lands are officially demarcated indigenous lands. Through the application of archaeology, biological anthropology, and linguistics, we aim to evaluate the process of land loss of the territory of Xavante from Maravaatseji, and to document the crime of at least negligence related to the forced displacement of this group, which resulted in the death of 85 individuals. In order to do so, we planned a series of in-depth interviews to carry out for the evaluation of the memory of the sacred sites, their cultural importance, and historical eyewitness accounts related to the analyzed events. Simultaneously, archaeological surveys were planned to understand the sacred places, their cultural meaning, and their territorial distribution. An excavation of a mass grave and anthropological analysis of skeletal remains was planned to properly document the events and to produce scientific evidence that would corroborate the case. Based on community participatory archaeology, the project also aims at providing strategies and guidelines for rescuing the memory of territorial occupation and returning recognition and respect to the places of importance, enabling the group to use the knowledge produced by academic research for the maintenance of their traditional customs and culture. The Xavante are an indigenous group that has been living in the central western region of Brazil at least since colonial times, and they remained isolated for much of the Brazilian colonial and post-colonial periods. At the beginning of the 18th century, they were inhabiting the territories that now are located in the state of Tocantins and Goiás. However, they moved westward because of the March to the West campaign. March to the West was a policy adopted by the Brazilian state in the 1940s to develop and integrate the so-called demographic voids, which meant mainly the central and western and northern territories of Brazil. The initial expeditions on its westward way encountered multiple indigenous groups that have been living there for hundreds of years. The initial idea was to integrate the indigenous communities within the Brazilian economy. However, due to their frequent and clearly understandable resistance, many were considered as aggressive warriors and obstacles to an ethnocentric notion of progress. Consequently, armed conflicts were common, and many communities were simply exterminated, forcibly displaced, or escaped towards the west for the search of peace and new lands. Territory of Marewat-Sedje was a target of the policy of occupation of indigenous lands that benefited private entrepreneurs and farmers. The withdrawal and conquest of indigenous land occurred with an intense persecution of the Shavante population. Armed squatters opened bites in the middle of the forest, and in compelling the expulsion of the indigenous people from their lands, many individuals, including children, were murdered. The community was at first compelled to accept either slavery or work within the infrastructure of the enterprise, receiving only food for their work, which basically was slavery. Eventually, in 1966, 263 Shavante that survived the terrible conditions they were subjected to by the landowners were compulsorily transported under the auspices of the Brazilian state by a Brazilian Air Force plane to the Salesian mission in São Marcos. There was a village located more than 400 kilometers south of their original territory. Meanwhile, in the early 1950s, the Shavante of São Marcos were occupying the region of Couto Magalhães. Still, because of the hostile ongoing March to the West campaign, they searched for shelter and help at the Salesian mission in 1956. And in 1958, they were transferred to the current São Marcos village, which is now their formally demarcated indigenous land. At the beginning of 1960s, and this is very important, the community of São Marcos was suffering from many repetitive epidemics of measles. After the transfer from Marewat-Sedje to the new territory, an ongoing measles epidemic outbreak in São Marcos was responsible for the dissemination of 1/3 of the newly transferred population, resulting in the death of 85 Shavantes from Marewat-Sedje and some individuals from São Marcos. Although the disease was already widespread in São Marcos, when the first transfer of the Shavante from Marewat-Sedje was carried out by the military, no sanitary measures were taken by the government to protect the indigenous people. The dead were thrown into a mass grave, making it impossible to carry out the funeral rituals and burial customs that are characteristic of the Shavante tradition. The preparation of the mass graves and the burial of the dead family members is still remembered today as an act of disrespect, pain, and helplessness by the survivors and witnessed to the event. When working with and for indigenous communities, archaeology has a great potential to unravel these forgotten and suppressed voices and bring social justice to minority groups victimized in the past and in the present. Particularly relevant to the group's identity, territorial claims, and understanding of the history of exploitation and expulsion is documenting and understanding the natural and social landscape utilizing georeference mapping technologies in combination with the meaning assigned to those places by the members of the group. In this context, our project aims at identifying the sacred places of the Shavante in the demarcated indigenous territory of Marewat-Sedje and São Marcos, registering the ancient territories of the occupation by the Shavante, and applying techniques of forensic archaeology and anthropology to register the possible evidences of measles epidemic that killed almost 90 Shavante individuals. Our project was granted the necessary authorization acquired by the Brazilian administration, as well as appropriate ethics committee approval, but most importantly, we received the approval of the community leaders as well. The fieldwork took place in July 2023. The project was conceived in 2019, but because of the pandemic, it had to be postponed several years. Interviews were conducted with both of the communities involved, and members of the community's sacred places were documented. In São Marcos, georadar mapping was performed to determine the location of the mass grave, and subsequently an archaeological excavation of the mass grave took place. The georadar survey indicated the existence of a longitudinal disturbance of land of approximately 30 meters in the location where many eyewitnesses indicated the location of the mass grave. Unfortunately, no skeletal material was preserved for analysis. However, sediments from the The burial sites were collected and now they are undergoing physical chemical analysis. It's important to highlight that the Shavanta of Maravatsegi were officially able to return to their territory in 2013. That is almost 47 years after the forced displacement to São Marcos, with the simultaneous expulsion of non-indigenous occupants from their territory. Nevertheless, some historically occupied villages are still outside of the officially recognized and demarcated Maravatsegi indigenous land. We expect that the results of this project can be helpful for the reconstruction and preservation of the history, culture, memory, and of the events that still compels the communities of the Shavana. We hope that this research could be a potential spark for future investigation on physical, social, cultural, and moral violence and crimes committed by the Brazilian state against indigenous groups. Our project is based on a theoretical perspective of different disciplines that combine aim to answer questions about conflicts and oppression of minority groups in the recent past, providing data to contribute to the justice system. Academic research also contributes to eliminate the policies and discourses that reinforce the colonial legacy and marginalize the indigenous groups. However, it cannot be conducted alone. Academics and indigenous people, victims of the human rights violation, working together during the whole investigation process can provide a better understanding of the objectives and purposes of the research, as well as the entire cultural and religious system in which they are working, in order to discuss the research results and its social impact in short, long, medium, and long-term contributions. This type of research is a work of a great responsibility for both parties. Academics need to be really involved with the reality, issues, and needs of the group they are working with, connecting forensic interface and human rights. Still, they must present effective, meticulous, and well-documented results from the research. Community archaeology has also great potential to provide tools for decolonization, giving indigenous communities more control over every stage of the process. Thank you very much.
When I read you for it, you really need to get in contact with minority rights group and you need to make a case out of it, I think. So from the past crimes to present ongoing human rights violations stemming from these crimes, now onto the future and the future of children. I'm handing over, maybe you can translate, and then we go on 10 minutes over, Paulo, then you have 15 minutes, and then Paulo, you can wrap it up, and maybe we have still 5 minutes or so for questions from the room, because we started also a little bit late.
Maybe
the whole conclusion, I think, yes. Okay.
Bonjour.
Sorry.
Bonjour, bom dia a todos, na minha língua povo autoctone. Boa tarde, Pangui, Teretu, Eroá, Samiá. Boa tarde, a língua do povo Cariri.
So good afternoon, everyone. I'm saying good afternoon in my language, the language of the people Cariri.
Hoje eu vou apresentar um trabalho que é parte da construção dos resultados da minha pesquisa de mestrado.
So today I'm going to present the work which is part of the construction of the results of my master thesis work.
Eu sou Adriana Fernandes Carajá.
My name is Adriana Fernandes Carajá.
Sou do povo Cariri Sapuiá.
I come from the people Cariri Sapuiá.
Do sudoeste da Bahia.
South west of Bahia State.
Sou doutoranda em antropologia social.
I'm a candidate doctorate PhD student in social anthropology.
Sou ativista das causas indígenas.
I'm an indigenous activist.
E sou xamã.
And I'm a shaman.
Desde o mestrado, minhas pesquisas versam sobre a retirada compulsória de filhos de mulheres em situação de vulnerabilidade no Brasil.
So since my master thesis, my research, I concentrated on the forced withdrawal from children from their women, from their mothers.
O interesse sempre foi compreender sobre a violação do direito à maternidade.
My interest was always to understand the violation of rights to maternity.
Em vários momentos da história brasileira,
In several moments of the Brazilian history,
Mães que já tiveram
the mothers who had done
fazem uso abusivo de álcool e outras drogas,
or use excessively alcohol and all the drugs,
com trajetória de rua
who live in the streets
ou moradia precária,
or in precarious places,
especialmente as mulheres pobres,
especially for women,
negras e indígenas,
black and indigenous.
foram apontadas
They were pointed
como incapazes de exercer sua maternidade
as incapable to exert their maternity,
e assim alvos de estratégia de controle sobre a vida destas e de seus filhos.
and thus they became target of strategies of control of their lives and those of their children.
Isso acontece através de medidas cautelares
This happens through measures of control
que acabaram por muitas vezes
that ended by
intensificar fragilidades,
augmenting their fragilities
dessa forma, acirrando a dificuldade da oferta de cuidados
and increasing the difficulties to access to health and to care
pelas políticas públicas.
by public policies.
As lacunas de cuidado e violação de direitos se reforçam
The gaps on care and violation of human rights reinforce
uma razão de mundo
a reasonable world
que produz a pobreza,
which produces poverty.
que produz a violência
Which produces violence
como estratégia para a exclusão,
as a strategy to exclude,
resignando limites práticos
resignating practical limits
quanto ao direito à maternidade.
with regards to the right to maternity.
Em 2017,
In 2017,
estimava-se que 60%
it was estimated that 60%
das crianças institucionalizadas
of children that were institutionalized
em abrigos do município de Dourados, no Mato Grosso do Sul,
in institutions of the city of Dourados in Mato Grosso do Sul
são indígenas.
were indigenous.
A retirada
The withdrawal
dos filhos das mulheres indígenas
of children of indigenous women
ocorre por determinações da Vara da Infância e da Juventude,
is determined by justice of children and children
do município de Dourados,
of childhood of the municipality of Dourados,
que inclusive já foi questionado
which was questioned
por meio de relatórios
by reports
da Fundação Nacional do Índio, seja correto indígena,
of the national foundations of the Indian. The correct term should be indigenous,
FUNAI e da Defensoria Pública
and the public attorney
do Estado do Mato Grosso do Sul.
of the state of Mato Grosso do Sul.
Então, a pesquisa tem como objetivo
So the aim of the research
refletir sobre o sequestro de crianças indígenas e suas comunidades,
was to reflect on the kidnapping of indigenous children in their communities.
Para isso, recorreu-se à análise de trechos das narrativas de duas mulheres da Grande Assembleia de Mulheres Guarani Kaiowá, a Cunhaguete Laçu,
So this is why I adopted an analysis of discourses of two women from the great gathering of Guarani women and Kaiowá women,
e trechos da ata dessa Assembleia e documentações institucionais,
and institutional reports
como da FUNAI.
such as from FUNAI.
Essa pesquisa compõe minha dissertação de mestrado,
The research composes my master thesis,
concluída em 2019,
concluded in 2019,
intitulada
entitled
Diário Cartográfico das Mães que Perdem Suas Filhas e Filhos pelas Mãos do Estado, Paisagens que se repetem.
Cartographic report from mothers who lose their children for mothers of the state, landscapes which repeat themselves.
Durante a pesquisa,
During the research,
identificou-se que o Poder Judiciário,
it was identified that the justice system,
ao aplicar o ECA,
when it implemented ECA, the legal framework for children,
e a Constituição Federal,
and the federal constitution,
legislações brasileiras,
it means Brazilian legislation.
ignorou completamente
It ignored completely
os dispositivos legais que afirmam ser necessários
law that state be as necessary
a manutenção das crianças com suas famílias extensas,
to maintain children with their closest family members,
avós, tios e tias e toda a comunidade,
such as grandparents, uncles, and all the community,
priorizando a adoção ao invés do melhor interesse dos menores.
in order to prioritize the adoption of the best interests of the children.
O governo, ao separar uma criança indígena de sua família,
When the government separated an indigenous children from its family, his or her family,
sem dialogar com as pessoas daquela comunidade,
without dialoguing with people from that community,
não realizando mapeamento da família extensa
not producing a cartography of the extended family,
e ainda inserindo essa criança em uma instituição de abrigamento compulsório,
and inserting these children in a home for compulsory institution
no modelo do Caraí, não indígenas,
in the model of the non-indigenous, the Karai,
pode acarretar em transtornos para as relações intrafamiliares.
can produce troubles for the intra-family relations.
Torna-se evidenciado
It became evident
o genocídio da população indígena,
that the indigenous population witnessed and was a target of a genocide
orquestrado
produced
pelos conflitos agrários
by the agrarian conflicts
provocados pelas grandes latifundiárias,
provoked by the greatest and big properties of land,
que cobiçam as terras indígenas
which tried to grasp indigenous land
para a expansão de seus negócios.
to expand their business,
E ainda pela omissão estatal,
and the occlusion from the state,
que se desresponsabiliza
which excludes its responsibility
e ignora
and ignores
a dívida histórica
the historical debt
que possui
that it possesses
para com esses povos.
with those peoples.
É nítido que há uma relação forte
It is clear that there is a strong relation
entre gênero,
between gender,
classe e raça,
class and race,
apontando para as origens
pointing towards the origins
que selecionam
which select
mulheres negras, indígenas e pobres.
Black, indigenous, and poor women.
Para os povos indígenas,
For the indigenous peoples,
a principal motivação da luta pelo território
the main goal to defend the territories
é o futuro das crianças.
is the future of children,
A garantia de aplicação de seus direitos,
to guarantee the application, the preservation of their rights,
assim como está profundamente relacionada
as well as it is profoundly linked
à manutenção de seu modo de ser tradicional.
to maintain their mode of being as being tradition.
Sendo assim,
This said,
a permanência das crianças em seus territórios
for the children, the possibility of being in their territories, staying in their territories,
para nós, povos indígenas,
for us, indigenous peoples,
significa que eles vão continuar existindo.
it means that they will continue to exist.
Sua língua
Their language
e seus costumes
and their habits
não morrerão.
will not die.
E além disso,
Beyond that,
quando as crianças indígenas saem do território,
when indigenous children leave the territory,
perdão,
I'm sorry,
elas deixam de aprender
they stop learning
por meio da oralidade
through orality
com os mais velhos,
with the oldest ones,
seus costumes e tradições.
their customs and tradition.
As mulheres indígenas
Indigenous women
e suas crianças
and their children
estão sendo vítimas
are being the victims
de múltiplas violências
of multiple
e
violences
seus desdobramentos,
and their consequences.
visto que elas sofrem
They suffer
com as determinações do Poder Judiciário
from the impositions of the law system, of justice system,
e pela execução de práticas biopolíticas
and the execution of biopolitical practices
que desejam
which aim
domesticar seus corpos,
to domesticate their bodies,
controlar seus desejos,
control their desires,
cercear sua liberdade
stop their liberty
em relações interpessoais.
and their interpersonal relations.
o sequestro de crianças indígenas vivendo em contexto urbano,
the kidnapping of indigenous children living in urban areas
merece atenção.
deserve attention
Visto que essas crianças são penalizadas
because they live a penalty
de várias formas.
in several ways.
Primeiro, porque foram expulsas dos seus territórios.
First, because they were exposed from their territories,
Depois, porque passaram a ser consideradas não indígenas,
and after, because they stopped being considered as indigenous
na visão eurocêntrica.
in the Eurocentric vision.
E, por fim,
Finally,
por terem sido institucionalizados
for having been institutionalized
e encaminhados para adoção em famílias não indígenas,
and sent to adoption by non-indigenous families,
vivendo afastados do seu povo.
living far from their peoples.
A retirada compulsória de crianças indígenas,
The compulsory withdrawal of indigenous children,
sejam Guarani Kaiowá
being Guarani Kaiowá
e de outros povos,
or other indigenous peoples,
ainda permanece.
still stands.
E essa impressão de que o problema foi solucionado
And this impression that the problem was solved
reflete o silenciamento das vozes
reflects the silencing of voices
instituído pelas ameaças
stated by threats
e perseguições
and persecution,
ainda muito presentes
still very strong
no cotidiano das instituições.
in the day-by-day of institutions.
A visão reducionista
The reductionist vision
vem gerando formas de exclusão,
provokes exclusionary forms,
impondo ação
imposing an action
baseada exclusivamente na eficiência
based exclusively on the efficiency,
e assim propondo medidas análogas
and thus proposing analogous measures
para lidar com situações distintas,
to face different situations,
desconsiderando quem são os sujeitos das histórias
not considering who are the subjects of histories
e quais são os seus territórios.
and which are their territories.
O desafio que se apresenta
The challenge
é o de
stated
é o de superar a judicialização da vida
is to overcome the the process of making it a justice system of life
em oposição
in opposition
à oferta do cuidado a essas mulheres.
to offering care for these women.
Desse modo, dessa forma,
Such said,
as ideologias colonialistas
the colonialist ideologies
ainda se encontram enraizadas na sociedade,
are still deep in the society,
manifestando a intencionalidade em extinguir os povos indígenas.
manifesting the intentionality of extinguishing indigenous peoples.
Boa, gratidão, mais uma vez agradecer o convite
Thank you very much for the invitation.
e peço perdão pelas vezes, né? Acho que estar nesse lugar, né, nesse espaço, não somente eu, mas todos os parentes que compartilham dessa experiência é algo bem novo, bem recente para nós, povos indígenas, não somente do Brasil, mas de toda a Beala, de todo o mundo.
Be in this space is something very new to indigenous peoples like me from all the Abya Yala. So I'm sorry for any.
Maravilhosa.
Yes, this is a very moving example how genocide can also be silent. So, Paulo, I'm handing over to you.
¿Lo hago en español o en inglés?
Español.
Español, ok. Bueno, buenas tardes por allá para todos y todas. Por acá, yo soy en Colombia. Estamos empezando la mañana. Les agradezco por la oportunidad de comentar sus investigaciones, que realmente son inspiradoras y resuenan también con mi trabajo. Yo en este momento soy subdirector de justicia del Centro de Estudios de Derecho, Justicia y Sociedad acá en Colombia, y mi investigación ha estado como en la intersección entre los estudios jurídicos y la antropología. Voy a hacer unas reflexiones, digamos, generales para conectar sus trabajos y de pronto dejo ahí como en algunas preguntas en el debate, pero quiero hacer como, digamos, conexiones especialmente porque creo que sus trabajos resuenan de múltiples maneras. En primer lugar, digamos, creo que estas 5 investigaciones de alguna manera hacen una conexión temporal entre el pasado y el presente. Eso que Walter Benjamin denominaba historia espectral, que es, digamos, que el pasado de alguna manera sigue presente en la vida cotidiana que tenemos que llevar en el día a día. Y en el caso, digamos, de la historia de los pueblos indígenas, esto también está muy presente en su percepción cosmológica, porque, digamos, la voz de los antepasados es una voz que aparece para mantener a las generaciones del presente y para sostener a las generaciones del futuro. Pero desde el punto de vista político, pues también, digamos, es claro que la historia colonial revive en el presente y que fenómenos como el genocidio a los pueblos indígenas es una cuestión, digamos, que está en curso y que no solo hace parte de la historia colonial. Entonces, creo, digamos, que en estos trabajos que resuenan también en el tiempo y en el espacio de Brasil, hay una apuesta muy interesante por conectar pasado con presente, sabiendo que también la forma, digamos, de intervenir en el futuro no puede dejar de lado ni los sueños, ni la dimensión más utópica que se mueve en estas luchas, como también, digamos, la cuestión más de cicatrices que ha dejado el colonialismo en estas tierras. En ese sentido, digamos, hay una cuestión que me parece también interesante para que la revisen. Yo vengo trabajando el tema de genocidio a pueblos indígenas hace muchos años, hace casi una década, y también vengo trabajando el tema de la justicia multiespecies, tratando de incorporar reflexiones del giro ontológico y de la antropología social para analizar, digamos, temas relacionados con el exterminio físico y cultural a los pueblos indígenas. Y algo que he aprendido, digamos, y que quiero dejar como sobre la mesa, es que hay que tener claro si uno quiere hacer intervenciones en este tema ante tribunales y si uno quiere hacer reflexiones más teóricas para impulsar el debate paso a paso en términos jurídicos. Y eso lo digo porque el genocidio, desde el punto de vista del derecho penal, es un delito que es muy difícil de probar, porque pues requiere un dolo especial, que es, digamos, que se pruebe la intención genocida, y eso ha sido inoperativo en derecho penal internacional desde la convención en la que aparece el delito, pero incluso, digamos, ya en la época del Estatuto de Roma, desde 1998, también el tipo penal ha sido prácticamente inoperativo. Eso, digamos, de alguna manera viene cambiando, se podría decir, si pensamos en el caso de Palestina. Por ejemplo, fue muy interesante que Sudáfrica decidiera llevar el caso a la Corte Internacional de Justicia, que es la competente para juzgar este tipo de crímenes, pero también en el sentido de que el Estatuto de Roma abrió el debate a también, digamos, los crímenes de lesa humanidad. Y desde el punto de vista jurídico, es más estratégico dar el debate como crimen de lesa humanidad, que no es menor que el genocidio, digamos, de hecho abarca el genocidio hace parte de los crímenes de lesa humanidad, que hacerlo en términos de genocidio, porque desde el punto de vista penal, el derecho ha sido también de alguna manera cómplice para que los culpables de estos delitos no se pudieran juzgar. Y ahí, digamos, el primer borrador de la convención, que lo redactó un jurista polaco, Rafael Lemkin, no diferenciaba entre genocidio físico y entre genocidio cultural. Ya la convención entra a hacer esa separación y en adelante pues se ha entendido, por lo menos en términos penales, que el genocidio es solo genocidio físico, es decir, matanza en masa. Y entonces, aunque los científicos sociales para cubrir eso empezaron a hablar, por ejemplo, de ecocidio o de etnocidio, el problema de esas categorías es que desde el punto de vista jurídico son inoperantes, porque no existen en los códigos penales ni en el de la Corte Internacional de Justicia, ni en el de la Corte Penal Internacional. Y eso no es menor. Si uno pues digamos, yo doy debates también en cortes y es una cuestión que no es menor, porque si no uno va a perder el caso. Entonces, digamos, esa es una cuestión que hay que tenerla en cuenta. Digamos, que es donde uno sitúa el debate. Y yo más o menos, digamos, en línea con Bartolomé Clavero, con el que tuve la fortuna de trabajar durante varios años, pues digamos, dimos el debate diciendo que esto es genocidio. O sea, que no se puede dividir el genocidio físico del genocidio cultural, que es genocidio. Acudiendo, digamos, tanto a la definición original de Lemkin como a otros avances legales que se han dado como en las últimas décadas. Sobre eso con Jessica Ayler escribimos un artículo en la Canadian Journal of Development Studies bueno, que se los puedo compartir luego. Y por otra parte, digamos, me parece que algo central también en este panel es la importancia, en todo caso, de la interdisciplinariedad para abordar estos casos. En ese sentido, digamos, por ejemplo, el trabajo interdisciplinario con arqueólogos, por ejemplo, es fundamental para hacer una conexión material entre el mundo de la cultura y el mundo de la naturaleza. Y en ese sentido, digamos, creo que es necesario como tratar de formar equipos interdisciplinarios que nos ayuden a avanzar también en reflexiones teóricas y metodológicas para que eventualmente se vaya abriendo el campo de discusión también, digamos, en los tribunales nacionales e internacionales. Cuestión que me parece que es clave, y en eso, digamos, los pueblos indígenas han sido mucho más versátiles e inteligentes que la academia no indígena, como lo mostró, digamos, la presentación de Adriana. Es muy necesario tanto el diálogo intercultural como avanzar en las posibilidades de coordinaciones interjurisdiccionales. Porque, digamos, lo que también queda de presente, como en estos casos que ustedes han presentado, es que la jurisdicción del Estado y la jurisdicción internacional prima sobre las jurisdicciones indígenas. Y en ese sentido, digamos, hay una necesidad cada vez mayor de potenciar coordinaciones interjurisdiccionales entre la jurisdicción del Estado y la jurisdicción indígena. En Colombia se ha dado un caso pionero. La Jurisdicción Especial de Paz es la primera corte, digamos, que acaba de sacar un protocolo de coordinación interjurisdiccional que se toma en serio a las jurisdicciones indígenas, y eso fue posible porque en esa corte hay magistradas indígenas y magistradas afrocolombianas. Entonces, digamos, creo que también en el centro de este debate, pues queda la idea también, o queda la necesidad de seguir reflexionando como en las mejores metodologías que nos permitan también, digamos, salir de lo teórico, que es muy importante, y ver también mecanismos, digamos, para avanzar en las cuestiones más prácticas. Y ahí, digamos, cierro mencionando tal vez la presentación de Belomonte, que es un caso que tuve la oportunidad de conocer porque dirigí la línea de agua dulce de AIDA, de la Asociación Interamericana para la Defensa del Ambiente, que es la asociación que ha llevado el caso. Una de las enseñanzas, por ejemplo, de ese caso, es que también no podemos perder de vista lo que ya tenemos, porque en la idea, por ejemplo, de avanzar hacia el reconocimiento de derechos a la naturaleza, que aquí en Colombia, digamos, también hay muchos casos de reconocimientos de ríos como sujetos de derecho, de territorios indígenas como víctimas de la violencia. Muchas veces lo que sucede es que eso es muy difícil de implementar y que perdemos de vista que hay instrumentos como por ejemplo el derecho de libre determinación que aparece en la Declaración de los Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas, pero también en la jurisprudencia de la Corte Interamericana de Derechos Humanos, que a veces pueden ser más operativos en los territorios. Entonces, digamos, obviamente es importante avanzar en estos debates, hay que hacerlo, es necesario, pero no se puede perder de vista también las luchas históricas que han llevado, por ejemplo, a la instrumentalización de convenios y de declaraciones, como no sé, el Convenio 169 y la Declaración de los Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas, que están ahí y que tienen mucho que aportar a estos debates. Entonces, digamos, creo que ahí también estratégicamente hay que matizar la crítica y hay que ver también en qué espacio se da, porque muchas veces, digamos, por querer hacer más, se hace menos. Entonces, yo dejaría ahí, digamos, y abriría pues el debate como para el público. Y bueno, les agradezco mucho
Yeah,
por...
already 15 minutes over, sorry to interrupt. We can either just stay here and then you can ask the question directly to the person on the panel. I think that might be one idea to share questions. Other questions? Because like the next session is in 15 minutes and we're already 15 minutes over. So maybe just stay like in the dialogue and then I would wrap up the session. Sorry for that. It was really rich, it was super engaging and I hope you took a lot from the very thought-provoking discussion. Thank you for the session and yeah, thanks for 15 minutes break until the next one.
Pablo, voy a cortar el Zoom entonces porque vamos a preparar la sesión siguiente. No sé si me escuchas bien. Muchas gracias por estar y perdón por no haber tenido tiempo de debatir.
Perfecto, que estén muy bien.
Que esté bien. Chao.
Chao.
Basic stuff.